We continue to follow a developing story out of college football. Texas and Oklahoma leaving the Big 12 in favor of the SEC is not a matter of if, it's now when. CBS Sports college football writer Dennis Dodd reports the Longhorns and Sooners intend to announce their decision to leave the Big 12 in the next day or two. If the programs were to make their SEC debut in 2022, each school would owe about $76 million to the Big 12 as a penalty for leaving before the current TV rights contract expires in 2025. And for more on this story, we welcome in CBS Sports HQ college football analyst Barrett Sallee, who's been tracking this story since it broke at SEC Media Days. Barrett, what more are you hearing about Texas and Oklahoma leaving for the SEC?
Well, like you mentioned, it sounds like the Big 12 is going to hear from Texas and Oklahoma soon, and then it's on the Big 12 to decide if they want to essentially live in a house with two teams that want to get a divorce in Texas and Oklahoma. And from what I've heard, that the Big 12, if this is the relationship they're going to have with Texas and Oklahoma, maybe they do just want to cut ties. And Texas and Oklahoma, I think, are willing to cut that check, whether it's $70 or $80 million each, in order to get to the SEC, because the SEC, in the long run, they will make so much more money that they will be able to cover that fee quicker, especially considering the SEC, based on its bylaws, will withhold some of their revenue just based on the transitioning rules they have. So the latest I've heard is that 2025 is when the deal runs out in the Big 12, but we might be looking at Oklahoma and Texas in the SEC a little sooner.
Would this be good for college football?
Yeah, I think it would, because you need consolidation of power. There's so, Hakeem, that's such a loaded question.
It is, right? It is.
So many tentacles to this. I think the biggest thing is the NCAA has stepped back from college football. We saw that a couple weeks ago with what Mark Emmert said. So if that's the case, there needs to be some sort of consolidation of power. And in reality, the landscape as it is right now, it's kind of hard to have a consolidation of power because you have so many different rules and so many different directions that these conferences are being pulled. So if the SEC does sort of take over and take the reins of the conference that controls everything, I think it's much more likely that A, you get super conferences, or B, and this might be the more likely scenario, you basically get the AFC, NFC. You get the American League, National League. You sort of have two entities coming together overall to look out for the betterment of the sport. So yeah, long answer short, I do think it's good for college football. Now it's going to come at the expense of a lot of teams and a lot of athletic departments, and that's going to make a lot of people mad. But in the end, consolidating power, look, we've always talked about, hey, you know what, college football should have a commissioner. Well, you're not going to get that. But I think you're going to come awfully close to that when all is said and done.
You know that's going to be the line, right, on talk radio. It's going to be like, hey, the Papadilla question of the day, is this good for college football? Call in and let us know. I mean, you know that's going to be the conversation over the next couple days and throughout the weeks until this becomes official. You talked about the questions and what this would mean. What would the departure of Texas and Oklahoma mean for Commissioner Bob Bowlesby and the rest of the Big 12?
Well, it's certainly going to be the hunted, not the hunter. And so I think a lot of conferences, especially the Pac-12 and the AAC, are really reaching out right now to find out if there's any interest, what the interest is. I think the Big 12 right now, it's almost impossible for the Big 12 to go add teams and make itself desirable to TV networks when the next round of negotiations comes up. So what do you do if you're the Pac-12, if you're the AAC? You try to gobble those teams up to increase your value. Because if you're the Pac-16, George Klavakov taking over as the Pac-12 commissioner, if you can suddenly make it the Pac-16, add a Baylor, add a TCU or whatever, then you're pretty attractive and you're at least in a better position than you are right now. And if you're the AAC, you start gobbling up as much as you can, because here's the thing, Hakeem, I don't think folks realize that Power 5, Group of 5 doesn't really matter that much anymore. We're looking at an era in the college football playoff where the 6 top conference champions get into the playoff. Doesn't matter what conference they're from. So yeah, in the past, you look at the Big 12 and say, oh, it's a Power 5 conference. It's got to have all this prestige. Well, no. the television rights, they're not going to get nearly as much money as they thought they would if Oklahoma and Texas were in the conference. And then B, it doesn't even really matter if you're a Power 5 conference because you can win the AAC and you're probably going to get in no matter what. So I think that the AAC is sitting in a good spot where it can basically pick and choose and say, all right, we're going to raise the level of our conference to a point where, yeah, more times than not, the AAC champion gets in, especially if it adds some really good Big 12 teams like an Oklahoma State or a Baylor or somebody like that. So it's going to be wide ranging. There's no doubt the impact of this is going to be felt throughout the era of the landscape of college football. And I think it can certainly help the Pac-12 and the AAC more than anybody else.
Well, we saw this 9 years ago. Texas A&M and Missouri left the Big 12. So now you have two more teams wanting to leave the Big 12. Could you see a situation where the Big 12 dissolves and the remaining members just go to perhaps the Big 10 or, like you mentioned, the AAC? I mean, you look at schools like Kansas, they could jump over to the Big 10. You look at schools like Baylor, they could jump over to the American Athletic Conference. I mean, there's so many options here. Could this perhaps be the end of the Big 12?
Absolutely. I think it is at the end of the Big 12 because we've always talked about 4-team super conferences, right? We've always assumed that there's 16-team super conferences. Well, the SEC is going to be there. We don't know if that's where it's going to stop, though, because the SEC clearly sees an opening to gain power, more power than any conference in college athletics history. So maybe it does go to 18, but even if it doesn't, yeah, the Big 12 is going to get picked apart because there are still desirable teams within that conference, most notably Oklahoma State. So, yeah, I think right now there was always this talk 10 years ago during the first round that the Big 12 was going to be the one that dissolves. And then it got kind of financially healthy for a little while. The Pac-12 suffered, and it's like, okay, maybe the Pac-12 is the one that's going to get picked apart. But in the end, if you lose Texas and Oklahoma, you have no leg to stand on if you're the Big 12. Yeah, you can add some teams, but it's not going to really move the meter in terms of your next TV contract. And that's the timeline they're working with right now. So I absolutely could see the Big 12 dissolving. And then you get to a point, yeah, 4 16-team super conferences. But really, if you're the AAC, you kind of jump in there now as well, especially considering the new playoff structure doesn't really demand 4 super conferences. It just demands at least 6 conferences, no matter where they are.
This would give us the nation's first ever 16-team super conference. And you were at SEC Media Days covering all the comings and goings here for CBS Sports HQ. And you heard some of the reaction, including Jimbo Fisher of Texas A&M, when asked about the idea of Oklahoma and Texas joining the SEC, said, quote, "I bet they would." What's more reaction? What's some of the other reaction you're hearing now a couple days later, because you're tuned in right there in Atlanta and you're right there in the middle of SEC country?
Yeah, I think the Texas A&M thing is interesting. I don't think there's any doubt that Texas A&M somehow, some way, no matter how it was done, certainly wanted to get the point across that this was happening and they were upset about it. I mean, Ross Bjork, I've been going to SEC Media Days since 2001. I've seen maybe 2 athletic directors there, but sure enough, as soon as this story gets leaked, Ross Bjork, the Texas A&M athletic director, comes strutting out of the elevator like Conor McGregor, wanting to talk to all of us and voice his displeasure. Now, I do think some of the quotes from Ross Bjork and Jimbo Fisher aren't necessarily being distorted, but it seems like they want to play both sides. They certainly don't want this, right? Texas A&M does not want Texas in the SEC. But if it does happen, I don't think they're going to be as mad as everyone sort of makes it out to be. In fact, talking to Ross Bjork on Wednesday, it's almost like he wanted to play both sides. He wanted to get the point across that he didn't like this, but left the door open to say, hey, you know what? Money talks. If they're making $70, $80 million a year, then come on, Texas, let's go. So I think Texas A&M, with what happened with Jimbo, they were ready for it. Jimbo gave his one-liner on the podium. He gave another one-liner on TV later, and Ross Bjork came out and voiced his displeasure. They felt like they had to appease those boosters who are anti-Texas that still live and die with that rivalry. But I think secretly they're okay with it happening as long as their revenue jumps, and by God, it is going to jump.
Look, you know this as much as I do. All the schools in the SEC, they're competing for recruiting in terms of Texas and Oklahoma. They're in Texas. They're in the state of Oklahoma. You know Nick Saban is in both of those states. So it's not like, oh, how does this affect Alabama or Auburn or Florida or Georgia? They've already had to deal with recruiting, trying to get guys from Texas, trying to get guys from Oklahoma. But when you look at some of the big boppers in the SEC, right, like the Alabama, the Georgia, the Floridas, like what's their take on all of this in terms of how that's going to impact them recruiting and then ultimately competitiveness when you talk about what's going to be expected in that super conference?
The big boys don't care, honestly. The big boys don't care. LSU is one that in reality has been really reliant on Texas over the last 10, 15 years. And when Texas A&M got into the SEC was the one that really picked up its Texas recruiting because it knew it had to. It devoted more attention to it. Florida, they're all about Florida. They'll get that access to Texas, which I think will actually help them. Auburn, Alabama, those teams as well. I think the teams that are really affected by this are Missouri and Arkansas, because I remember Arkansas back in its official media guide literally used to highlight the state of Texas and say, these are the number of players that we recruit and sign out of the state of Texas. That was right after Texas A&M got into the SEC because it still wanted to show, hey, you know what? We have heavy involvement in the state of Texas. That's diminished. And if Texas is in the SEC and Oklahoma is in the SEC, then it's going to be nearly impossible for Arkansas and Missouri to win those recruiting battles. So I don't think the teams that are recruiting juggernauts are going to care all that much. It's cutthroat. They all know that. They devote resources to it, and that'll continue. But it's the team like Arkansas, a team like Missouri that really rely heavily on those Texas high school players as well as the Oklahoma high school players. It's going to be really hard for them to stay up to date and to keep pace with what's going to happen.
It is indeed a seismic development. The Longhorns and Sooners intending to announce their decision within the next day or two, according to our Dennis Dodd. Barrett Sallee joining us here with the latest on CBS Sports HQ. Barrett, thank you. And again, if the programs were to make their SEC debut in, let's say, 2022, each school, Texas and Oklahoma, would owe about $76 million each to the Big 12 as a penalty for leaving before the current TV rights contract expires in 2025. Adding Texas and Oklahoma would give the SEC 16 teams. They went to 14 teams 9 years ago with the addition of former Big 12 schools Texas A&M and Missouri.
Do you want a sports network that delivers everything that matters about the game? The highlights, the picks, the instant analysis, no yelling, no fake debates, no politics. Hit the subscribe button and never miss a moment.